Me and my husband have been together for 8 years, married for 5. I'm not ashamed to say I was the pretty one in our relationship when we were dating. Before we got married, he was around 280 pounds and 511, didn't know how to choose clothes for himself, he hates shopping, and had a bald head. I fell in love with who he was as a person, even though I never cared for his looks. I was secretly assured that he wouldn't cheat on me. I was cheated on every single one of my relationships until he came along. When I think back to our first dates now, my memory stubbornly dredges up details rather than movie stills. An overly loose shirt with an absurd checkerboard pattern, faded jeans that he stubbornly called the most comfortable, and a smooth, shiny pate that he was embarrassed to cover with a baseball cap. That's not what I liked about him. I liked the way he listened carefully, the way he paused before responding, the way he sought meaning rather than victory in any contentious topic. After all my previous relationships, where betrayal lurked around every corner, his predictable honesty seemed like a safe haven. In the second year of marriage, his sister was diagnosed with a heart condition. Her excess weight wasn't an abstract aesthetic but a threat. And he said something I'd heard him say many times. "I'll go with you." 5 times a week, at 6 in the morning, into a room that smelled of rubber, iron, and someone else's determination. At first, I smiled skeptically. He had no trace of exercise habits, and he loved mornings the way I love crowded trams. But he went. My sister for life. He for his sister. The first month seemed like an endless cycle. Alarm clock, coffee, gym, work, sleep. At home, he'd collapse exhausted, and I thought he'd break down. But the breakdown didn't come. A strange light appeared in his eyes. First, the little things disappeared. Shortness of breath, the habit of propping his back with a pillow. Then came the habit of asking for a second slice of pizza for company. Instead, containers appeared in the kitchen. Buckwheat, chicken, broccoli, which I jokingly called the monk's trinity. After 6 months, I noticed his t-shirts fit differently. His shoulders had become fuller, the fabric no longer stretched across his stomach, and his usual home joggers suddenly felt too big. I didn't count the pounds, but the gym and the scale did. -10, -20, -30. We laughed together when we saw his cheekbones again for the first time. It turned out he had cheekbones, we'd just long forgotten about them. My sister melted and grew stronger simultaneously. The family's tremors of panic gave way to the tremors of heavy dumbbells. We celebrated every small victory. The first non-stop run, the first pull-up, with a band, but still, the first night without complaining of back pain. 2.5 years later, I caught myself one day with a strange sensation, as if a new person had entered our house, and the old one had quietly left, leaving a message on the refrigerator. "Don't miss me. I'm on business." In his place stood a man with strong shoulders, a strong jawline, and an unruly dark stubble that he laughingly called a side effect of protein. He was returning from the shower with a towel around his hips, wet strands of hair falling across his forehead, like in a shampoo commercial, and it almost seemed unfair. I'd gotten used to the him of the time, but the now one wasn't just different. He was the same man whose silhouette lingered in the shop windows we passed, and I was honestly happy. Happy for him, and for my sister, and for myself, because it felt like the 3 of us were pulling on the same rope and pulling a single boat against the current. Then life changed the cards. He was offered a promotion to department head. His former boss handed him business cards, shook his hand, and quietly advised him to improve his appearance because now you're the face of the department. He'd always hated shopping, and for the first time in years, I took him shopping without feeling guilty. We started small, basic shirts, decent trousers, the right fit. Then a jacket, which unexpectedly made his figure even more defined. Then he decided to grow his hair out, just to try it out. It turned out he had a thick, dense, heavy lock of hair, which he tossed back with a habitual gesture. I watched and thought about the capricious justice of genetics, as if the body had been accumulating potential for years, only to suddenly, on the surface, manifest its inner discipline. I was proud, and yes, there was a hint of surprised delight in it. Who knew men could grow their jawline? That a belly could disappear, and with it, the stiffness, the stares, and his old way of slouching, as if apologizing in advance for his presence. He began to walk differently, not proudly, no, simply evenly. His internal metronome had settled. The promotion to the department head brought not only new challenges, but also a new circle of people. For the first time, I saw how others looked at him. It happened at a company party, essentially a vanity fair. The glint of glasses, conversations over shoulders, laughter a tone too loud. We walked in, and in a few minutes I saw more glances at him than in all our previous years together. Not aggressive, admiring, focused, appraising. He, as always, didn't notice. His naive impenetrability, his old armor, had outlived his weight loss. At one point, a young employee, laughing, leaned toward him and kissed him on the cheek right in front of me. "She's French," he whispered later. "I thought that was their custom." I rolled my eyes, but inside I felt a slight ache. The new reality sounded like music, but this music had notes that weren't there before. A few weeks later, I heard stories. His girls from the marketing department who with. I don't mind at all staying late for a meeting, accidental elbow bumps in the narrow hallway, other people's notes with smiley faces left on the edge of his monitor. He brought them to me to show me, like found objects. "Look at this kindergarten." And indeed, it was a kindergarten, but a kindergarten that had grown out of adult soil. I wasn't jealous, not right away. I knew too well how he worked. He still harbored the belief that the world was fair and that people were mostly kind. This naivety had saved him from cynicism for many years. But now this same naivety made him vulnerable. I caught myself in a thick, sticky anxiety. Not today, not tomorrow. Someday we'd have a bad day, and someone else's smile would be too close. The numbers continued to rise, but no longer on the scale. He managed a department, then two. A couple of high-profile contracts, and his name was mentioned more often at planning meetings. He learned to speak publicly. He still disliked arguing for the sake of arguing, but now he had a firm grasp of the structure of his arguments. He began getting invited to conferences, and for the first time I saw how he looked on stage, confident, a little dry but convincing. And I rejoiced, seriously rejoiced, at his blossoming. It was just that the joy had acquired a tang, like a strong wine that warms and burns at the same time. At home, the geography of everyday life changed. His wardrobe multiplied, a clock appeared on the dresser, a gift from the board of directors, heavy as the words responsibility and power. In the bathroom, styling products, strange jars, the existence of which he would have laughed at a year ago. Our bed. We were closer, that's true. His body, new, strong, alive, changed our rhythm. For a long time, I didn't allow myself to think about anything disturbing, because intimacy, good, attentive, generous, seemed to disprove all doubts. And then the business trips began. Short ones at first, then longer. He was always texting, messages from airports, photos of breakfasts in sterile hotels, playful complaints about 3-hour meetings. I knew his language, it was transparent. And yet, as soon as his suitcases left me alone at night, an echo would creep into the apartment. I heard strangers' glances from that office party, strangers' laughter from those conference rooms, a stranger's voice. "Your wife is so happy." And I caught myself wishing, unnecessarily, for him to put his old, ridiculous jeans back on, just so the world could be the same, safer. Two women argued in my head, the one who rejoiced in his freedom from his own body, and the one who feared his freedom in the hands of others. In the spring, everything sped up. The company was preparing for a change of ownership. The old owner was tired, and the market was hungry. He returned from a meeting late, quiet as he often is before big news. He sat in the kitchen, took off his shoes, and held a cup of tea until the steam evaporated. He said simply, "They offered me to join the pool." I took a long time to process it. Pool meant a management shakeup. It meant a shareholding. It meant taking on the kind of risk usually borne by those at the top. He wasn't jumping for joy. He understood the cost. Further, everything resembled a cutting-edge editing process. Negotiations, signatures, a phone that never stopped ringing. His name appeared where someone else's had once been. He didn't become the owner overnight. He became a co-owner and gradually the key figure, the one people came to not just for reports, but for decisions. The cover of an industry magazine, an interview, the familiar whisper. Now that's a story of transformation. I looked at him and saw more than just his muscles and jawline. I saw the will that had dug a tunnel from a boy into a man, and it was beautiful and dangerous. At the same speed, a second life around me grew. At every presentation, there was a curtsying partner, beautiful, a little too attentive. At dinners after deals, they laughed, leaned in too close, said, "You're so inspiring," as if it were a password to another world. He, as always, returned home with stories about how it's all nonsense, and indeed, he didn't smell of someone else's perfume. But I knew not all explosions smell. Some just quietly raise the temperature. That fall, at yet another party for his company, I felt out of place at my own celebration for the first time. We walked in, and it was as if we walked in separately. Hands reached out to him, faces turned toward him, a half-tone of smiles was aimed at him. I stood next to him, holding a glass, nodding, responding politely, and gradually drawing myself inward like a spring. The PR girl, too smooth and confident, whispered to me, "You must be so proud of him." I smiled and thought, yes. But pride is not armor. On the way home, he, tired and happy, hugged me and asked if I wanted a burger tonight. I laughed, just the same way I had laughed during our first year. There was still a boy inside him. It was just that now the boy was sitting on the shoulders of a man who had learned to win. That night I lay listening to his even breathing, and I realized that my love for him seemed divided. One loved him for what he could do, the other feared what he could now do. And somewhere very deep in a place rarely reached by words, a thought briefly crossed my mind from, I felt ashamed. I wish he'd look like his old self sometimes. His slouchy sweatshirt, his ridiculous jeans, his baseball cap on his bald head. So the world would remember who he was, so he would remember. But the world owes nothing to anyone. And life, having started the turbine of his ascension, wasn't about to give us a break. He began driving more often, speaking more firmly, laughing more briefly. We still held on to our rituals, Sunday omelets, Friday movies, walks without phones. But these rituals were filled with discreet breaks. The monitor would flash on across the room, and he'd sigh and go off to answer the really need-it question. I pretended not to notice how we were living in a save now, continue later mode. At the end of that long first chapter, because it really is only the first, I stood by the window and looked out at the city. And I thought that perhaps this is exactly what the adult version of a fairy tale sounds like. You wish your loved one freedom from their fears and they get it. But along with it, they gain a whole world, one with too many strange doors. So far, they've all remained closed to them. But for the first time, I admitted to myself, I see the keys already turned in some locks. What follows will be a story not only of success, but also of choice. And the story of a man who will one day bring home an envelope with documents, and I will learn to live with the fact that one love can turn into another. Love for myself, for my destiny, and for the new peace I will build without him. But there are still a few steps to go. For now, I'm here, and our home still breathes the same air. I've simply learned to listen to it a little more attentively. The promotion turned out to be only the beginning. What started as a department head position evolved quickly into something much larger. His results spoke louder than words. Contracts doubled, profits rose, and within 2 years, he wasn't just the man they promoted. He was the man they needed. When the company's owner decided to step down, they didn't look for an outsider. They looked straight at him. They offered him shares, a seat at the board, and eventually, the title that once felt unreachable, CEO. Overnight, my husband, the man who once hated mirrors and baggy shirts, was running the very company that had once intimidated him. With power came wealth, and with wealth came a kind of attention neither of us was prepared for. Invitations poured in, private dinners, charity galas, business trips that blurred into vacations. Luxury cars replaced his old beaten-up sedan. Magazines wanted interviews. Industry events treated him like a celebrity. And with all that came them women who, a few years ago, wouldn't have looked at him twice. Now they hovered at events in silk dresses and perfect smiles, leaning just a bit too close, laughing just a bit too hard at jokes that weren't that funny. They whispered compliments disguised as business talk. Some were subtle, some were shameless. And while he remained polite, maybe even oblivious, I knew exactly what I was looking at. Temptation dressed in perfume and ambition. It wasn't just the women. It was the way the world itself began to shift around him. He was no longer my husband who came home and kicked off his shoes. He was the man investors wanted lunch with, the man whose decisions affected hundreds of people, the man people tried to impress. I still saw glimpses of the man I married, the one who burned pancakes on Sunday mornings, who laughed until he cried at stupid memes. But now he wore tailored suits and came home too tired to talk. He started using phrases like, "We'll circle back," and "I'll have my assistant schedule it." He was still kind, still gentle, but the world was pulling him in a direction I couldn't follow. And then one quiet evening, he came home with a manila envelope. He didn't look at me when he handed it over. Inside were divorce papers. My hands trembled as I flipped through them. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't a betrayal I could point to. It was colder, a decision made on paper, calculated and distant. He said he'd fallen out of love, that he needed space to grow, that it wasn't about anyone else. Maybe it was true. Maybe it was. All I know is that in that moment, the man I thought I knew, the man I helped build, was gone. The house felt emptier after that. The walls echoed with silence where laughter used to be. Friends called. My mother cried. I felt like I was drowning in humiliation and betrayal. But once the storm of shock passed, another feeling crept in, one I didn't expect: clarity. If he thought he could just walk away and leave me broken, he was wrong. I hired the best lawyer I could find. And when it was all over, I walked away with half of the wealth, half of the empire I helped him build, half of the future he thought would no longer include me. At first, I didn't know what to do with it. The money sat in my account like an accusation. But slowly, I began to breathe again. I bought a small villa overlooking the sea, not too big, not too showy, but mine. I traveled. I studied things I'd always been curious about. I learned to invest. I met new people not as his wife, but as me. And then something unexpected happened. I stopped being angry, not because he deserved forgiveness, but because my life stopped revolving around the person who left. I was no longer a supporting character in his success story. I was the protagonist of my own. Sometimes I hear about him in the news. Another deal closed, another magazine cover, another beautiful woman on his arm. And instead of pain, I feel nothing. Or maybe something close to gratitude. Because if he hadn't handed me those divorce papers, I might never have discovered how powerful life can be when it's finally yours alone. He built an empire, but so did I. Mine just doesn't need him in it. The first few weeks after the divorce were a blur. Lawyers, meetings, signatures, all of it mechanical, all of it hollow. People talk about heartbreak like it's a single event, like it happens all at once. But the truth is, heartbreak lingers. It shows up in the quiet moments: the empty chair at breakfast, the unshared jokes, the instinct to text someone who's no longer yours. For a while, I let myself fall apart. I cried until my eyes ached. I walked through the house, our house, like a ghost, touching the walls, the furniture, the memories we built. Every corner whispered us, and every whisper reminded me that us no longer existed. But life, stubborn as it is, doesn't stop for heartbreak. Bills still come. The sun still rises. And one morning, so did I. The settlement was generous, more than I'd ever imagined. It wasn't just money. It was a chance. A chance to rebuild, to reinvent, to live a life that wasn't tethered to someone else's shadow. I started small. A solo trip to Italy, something I'd always dreamed of but never had the courage to do. There, standing on a balcony overlooking the Amalfi Coast with a glass of wine in my hand, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. I came back different, stronger, hungrier. I decided that the rest of my life would not be defined by what he took from me, but by what I built for myself. I hired financial advisors and learned everything I could about investing. I started a small interior design firm, something I'd always loved but never pursued because it wasn't practical. Within a year, it wasn't just profitable, it was thriving. I opened a second office, then a third. My company began designing boutique hotels, luxury apartments, and offices for rising tech companies. For the first time, my name was on contracts, my signature closed deals. And slowly, something shifted in how people looked at me. I was the ex-wife anymore. I was me, a woman with a business, a vision, a life that no longer revolved around someone else's orbit. But success brought something else too: perspective. I realized how much of myself I had dimmed to fit into his world. I had shaped my dreams around his, sacrificed my ambitions for his comfort. And now, standing on my own, I understood that I had been capable all along. I had just forgotten. Months turned into a year, and the gossip faded. People stopped whispering about the divorce. Occasionally, I'd see his name in an article or hear about some new project he was leading. And yes, sometimes I'd see photos, him on red carpets, with women who looked like they belonged on magazine covers. The old me might have felt jealousy, bitterness, regret. The new me just turned the page and moved on. Because here's the thing about freedom. Once you've tasted it, you never want to give it up again. I started hosting charity events, not to show off, but because I wanted to build something beyond myself. Scholarships for young women in business, grants for single mothers starting companies, a mentorship program to help women navigate industries still dominated by men. And every time I spoke at an event or signed a new deal, I felt that same calm strength growing inside me. I didn't need him. I never really did. One night, almost 2 years after the divorce, I attended a gala. My company had just signed its biggest client yet, a luxury hotel chain expanding across Europe. As I walked through the ballroom, people stopped to congratulate me. Cameras flashed. Investors shook my hand. And then I saw him. He was standing across the room, tuxedo crisp, charm intact, a woman half his age on his arm. For a moment, our eyes met. There was a flicker recognition. Maybe nostalgia. He raised his glass slightly, a silent acknowledgement. I smiled politely, then turned away. I didn't walk over. I didn't feel the urge to speak, because there was nothing left to say. Our story had ended, and mine had begun. Later that night, as I stood on the balcony of my penthouse, city lights glittering below, I realized something profound. I had feared that losing him would break me. But losing him didn't break me, it set me free. And freedom, I discovered, is far more intoxicating than love ever was. Success has a sound. It isn't applause or champagne corks. It's the simple, steady rhythm of competence meeting momentum. Emails answered on time, teams that trust each other, designs approved on the first draft, invoices paid early because clients want to book the next project before you're fully free. That was the soundtrack of my life the year after the gala. The firm grew the way a tree grows when it finds light, upward, outward, then deeper. We stopped taking one-off apartment refreshes and focused on projects that could shape a neighborhood. Boutique hotels with a story, mixed-use buildings that respected the street they stood on, office floors that didn't feel like fluorescent farms. Whenever someone asked for a mood board of marble and status, I countered with texture, longevity, and a floor plan that made people kinder to one another. Clients started repeating my phrases back to me in meetings, as if they had always believed them. That's when I knew the brand had clicked. I hired deliberately. People who cared about the unglamorous hours that make beauty look effortless. A project manager who could see 6 weeks into the future and still keep today neat. A junior designer who understood that one good curve could replace 3 gimmicks. An operations lead who could read a contract like an X-ray. I told them from the beginning that I would not pretend balance was effortless. There would be late nights in sprints and quiet Fridays when we guarded the afternoon like a small country. We would tell the truth to each other and to clients, even when the truth cost money. They followed me because they could feel that I meant it. Money came anyway. Not the brittle, show-me kind, but the quiet kind that accumulates when reputation outruns marketing. We expanded into 2 new cities. A hospitality group offered a retainer so high I reread the email twice before answering. I said yes with conditions. Creative ownership where it mattered, veto power over waste disguised as luxury, and a clause that allowed us to walk away if they buried us in committee. They agreed. They wanted the certainty of someone who had a spine. At home, the villa began to feel less like a shelter and more like a companion. I changed the kitchen. It changed me back. I worked at the long oak table some mornings with the doors thrown open to the sea, and for the first time work did not feel like a plea for legitimacy. It felt like simply being myself at scale. I invested thoughtfully, some in index funds, some in a quietly promising materials startup run by a woman who could speak about polymers like poetry. Some in a training program that turned out apprentices who knew both software and a hand plane. Every few months, the past tried to wave hello. A magazine requested a joint feature on 2 success stories that started together. I declined without heat. A mutual friend dropped a line about a yacht party and a familiar last name attached to it. I answered with a neutral emoji and changed the subject. My former life was not a villain to be defeated. It was a city I no longer lived in. I wished it well from across the water. There were other men, eventually. It would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Attention came once my independence stopped needing to announce itself. I learned to enjoy the soft start of something without auditioning for permanence. I kept my own address and my own accounts, not as armor but as posture. When affection arrived with patience and good humor, I let it stay. When it arrived with performance and appetite, I sent it away with thanks. The quietest surprise was how little I missed the noise that used to pass for romance. The firm hit a different altitude the day a global developer asked us to lead the design for a flagship property in a capital city where beauty and power have always argued in public. The brief read like a dare, a hotel that felt inevitable, as if it had always been there and would always remain. I flew in early and walked the street at dawn, counting the ways morning light told the truth. The site wanted restraint, not spectacle. We returned a proposal that left half the budget unspent and all the dignity intact. They approved it the same week. Awards followed, useful only insofar as they calmed board members and opened doors to municipalities that prefer credentials embossed on thick paper. I accepted them the way one accepts a coat check ticket. Practical, temporary, not the point. My team celebrated properly anyway, with bad dancing and a cake that tasted like the inside of a summer fruit. It was around that time that I learned a version of gravity I hadn't felt before. When you stop asking permission, the world stops offering it and begins offering partnership instead. A university invited me to teach a short studio. I built a semester around something no one had given me when I was younger: how to defend your ideas without setting yourself on fire. The students, brilliant, stretched thin, hungry for a vocabulary that included both rigor and mercy, taught me back. I left each evening with my head buzzing and a tender ache under the sternum that felt like purpose. On a gray Tuesday, an email arrived with a subject line that used my full name the way a childhood friend does when teasing. The sender was a journalist I respected, and the body of the message was concise. Would I comment, on or off record, about a corporate restructuring at my ex-husband's firm? There was nothing malicious in the request, only the assumption that I might have a perspective. I stared out the window at a slice of unremarkable sky and realized I had none to offer. The company he ran was doing what big companies do, shedding skins, trading caution for growth, correcting later. It had nothing to do with me. I wrote back wishing them luck on the story and declined to be quoted. The journalist replied with a smile I could hear in the words and let me go. Another invitation arrived from a foundation board, then another from a city task force charged with turning a derelict pier into something between a park and a promenade. I accepted the second and declined the first. I preferred places where you could stand on the ground and see the use of your time. On the pier, I fought for benches that faced both water and people, because sometimes it is a relief to look outward, and sometimes it is a relief to belong. The money had long since become numbers that startled past versions of me. I gave some away strategically and some away quietly. A scholarship in my mother's maiden name. A fund that paid for site supervision hours so young designers weren't trapped behind screens. Rent for a year for a woman who left a marriage without a safety net and arrived at my office asking only for work and a chance to learn. She now runs our studio in Lisbon. If this sounds like a clean arc, it was. There were mishires and misreads, contracts that cost more to enforce than to forgive, 2 months when I let a project get too close to my ego and paid with poor sleep for it. I kept a note above my desk that said, "Make rooms where people breathe easier." When my calendar tried to turn me into someone I did not recognize, I returned to that sentence and rescheduled the day around it. 2 years into the flagship project, as we prepared for opening, a mutual acquaintance asked whether I would attend the gala. It was a reasonable question. Our firm's name was on the plaque. I considered the optics, then considered the hour I would lose to smaller talk than I could justify. I sent my team and stayed home, ordering excellent takeout and writing thank you notes by hand until my wrist complained. The photographs came through the next morning, my staff polished and joyful, the lobby looking exactly as inevitable as we had promised. Among the images was a familiar silhouette 3 rows back, head turned slightly, listening to a speech. I felt nothing twist inside me. I only noticed that the tuxedo fit well and that he seemed exactly where he had wanted to be for a long time. Sometime later, on a flight that left at an indecent hour, I found myself thinking about the version of me who once believed safety could be engineered by choosing a partner who would never be tempted. That woman had been through a geography lesson no school could teach. Love is not zoning, fidelity is not a security system, and certainty is a story we tell to fall asleep. What you can build, what remains when the rain comes, is capacity, capacity. To act with clarity, to choose with open eyes, to rebuild without bitterness when rebuilding is what life asks of you. The plane banked. The city below turned and turned again until the runway took its single necessary line. We landed on time. My phone greeted me with the usual mixture of approvals, questions, and one urgent photo from a site lead who had discovered, to his alarm, that the travertine we had approved looked blue in certain light. It did, and it didn't matter. We would choose the warmer batch and move the sconces by 4 inches. The day unfolded the way good days do. Solvable problems, meaningful conversations, the hum of a machine that does not consume its own. That evening, I stood at my kitchen counter with a knife that knew my hand and cut peaches into a bowl the color of late afternoon. A friend would arrive shortly. We would eat, and we would laugh, and she would show me photographs of a child who had just discovered rain. I looked out at the sea, a living thing that kept its promises by never making any, and felt a steady gratitude without ceremony. People sometimes ask, with shy curiosity, whether I ever think about finding love again. I tell them the truth. Love is not a relic I keep in a drawer. It is a room I live in differently now. There is space. There is light. There are chairs for guests and a door that opens easily from both sides. When someone worthy knocks, we will see. In the meantime, there is work I would do even if no one knew my name. There are women whose first invoices I want to pay. There are streets that deserve kinder corners. He built a company and then a reputation and then a legend his investors could toast. I built a practice and then a platform and then a life that fits its owner. When I pass a mirror now, I do not check for loss. I check for alignment between what I say and what I do, between what I design for others and what I allow for myself. The empire I wanted turned out not to be made of towers. It is made of mornings that belong to me, teams that do excellent work without cruelty, and the clean knowledge that abundance kept moving through me without getting stuck. If I have wealth now, and I do, it is measured most honestly in the number of decisions each day that are mine to make. That is the quiet luxury no settlement can buy, and no man can sign away. People like to compress endings into a clean line. He handed over papers, we divorced, I rebuilt. That version is tidy and untrue. The truth was a corridor of fluorescent-lit rooms, conference tables that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, and a calendar that sprouted appointments like weeds. The truth was a legal process that treated love like a ledger and history like a spreadsheet. He had wanted a simple split, simple in the way a check with fewer zeros is simple. His lawyers framed our years together as separate economic spheres. His income, his risk, his upside, my companionship, my supportive role, my non-monetized care. It was astonishing how a narrative can be rearranged when it suits a balance sheet. I did not rage. I documented. I cataloged the invisible, years of managing the domestic infrastructure that made his endurance possible. The pre-dawn breakfasts that fueled those first gym sessions, the travel logistics I memorized before we could afford assistance, the early edits on the speeches that would later earn him applause, the quiet social work of dinners that led to opportunities because a table had been set with the right mix of people. I showed the emails, the slides with my fingerprints on them, the drafts I had cut down until they became air in his lungs. I brought witness statements from people who had sat at our table and seen the engine under the hood. My lawyer, a woman whose calm could lower a room's temperature by 2 degrees, turned support into contribution and behind into alongside. She reminded the court that equity is not only a number, it is a story of compounding. When the opposing counsel tried to characterize my life as lifestyle, she called it what it was, unpaid labor that created margin for risk. She did not sneer. She cited. He looked tired in those rooms. I did, too. There is no victory in watching someone you once loved argue for your smallness, but there was clarity. When the settlement finally arrived, fair not because it was generous, but because it recognized the architecture of an adult life, it was less a windfall than the acknowledgement that I had not been a passenger. I had been a builder without title. With the legal work concluded, another theater opened, public narrative. A few outlets tried to angle the story toward melodrama, before and after photographs of him, captions that used words like transformation and new chapter, and in one case, a speculative paragraph about me that used the phrase left behind. I did not issue statements. I did not give interviews. I made myself uninteresting to the machine by refusing to feed it. The machine moved on. Still, the city has a way of returning the past to your doorstep in the form of happenstance. I once stepped into a cafe and found two junior executives at a corner table dissecting a profile of him as if it were an exam. They praised the audacity, the deal cycle, the relentless hours. One of them wondered aloud whether the new girlfriend would make the cut. I sipped my coffee and thought how strange devotion looks when it is described by outsiders as strategy. They weren't wrong. They were simply reading a map with a legend that included only roads. My own press, when it came, was narrower and more precise. Trade journals analyzing a project's restraint, a feature on the workshop we funded that taught site foremen how to carve 10% inefficiency out of a build without hounding anyone. A small podcast conversation where I tried to explain why a hallway deserves as much thought as a lobby because most of living is transit, not arrival. I found that I liked this scale of attention, specific, contained, uninterested in my dinner companions. The new life settled into an honest tempo, days with the assurance of work that fits, nights with the ease of rooms that hold me. And then the world shook a little. It wasn't a scandal, it was a cycle. Markets tightened. Capital, which had flowed like a generous river, became cautious. His company announced a strategic contraction. It made the papers. Analysts speculated. Staff braced. I read the coverage, the way one reads whether warnings for a town one no longer lives in. Concerned, detached, aware of the geography, but not in the path of the storm. Our paths crossed unexpectedly at an awards dinner neither of us could reasonably skip. The evening ran on the usual electricity, microphones that give confidence to the shy and swagger to the already loud. He stood on stage and thanked teams, partners, the inevitability of hard work. I stood later and talked about material honesty and the mathematics of hospitality. The applause for both of us was generous, and the walk to our separate cars even more so. In the space between those claps, there was no magnet, no ache, only a fact. We had each kept going in the direction we had chosen. After that night, an email from his counsel arrived, perfunctory and properly worded, about the last administrative item from our settlement, vesting on a tranche that had matured. Numbers, transfers, signatures, I signed. The funds landed with the same lack of poetry as any other payment. I allocated some to the foundation that funds childcare stipends for apprentices. I moved some into a long-term vehicle that will quietly outrun inflation. I bought nothing that day and felt very rich. It was around then that I was invited to speak to a room of women about rebuilding. I almost declined. The word carries an implication of ruin. But I went and I told them the truer thing. My life had not been reduced to ashes, it had been edited. And editing is where the craft lives. I told them to keep receipts, not only paper ones, but the internal receipts that tell you what a day costs and whether you want to spend that again. I told them to build back not bigger, but truer. After the talk, a young woman approached with the hard gleam of new pain in her eyes. She asked how I handled the angriest days. I said I had tried to outrun them until I learned to give them a task. I told her I had assigned my anger work. Protect the morning, protect the payroll, protect the girls coming up behind me. She nodded and wrote it down like it could be a hinge. Perhaps it was. There were still nights when the house spoke softly of the past. I let it. Memory is not an enemy unless you try to evict it. I made tea, read old recipe cards in a familiar hand, and slept in the middle of the bed. In the morning, the sea did what it always does, argued for constancy by changing every hour. One afternoon, on a site visit, I watched a crew chief adjust a beam by a fraction no eye but his would catch. That is what saved the ceiling from hairline cracks 2 winters later. Precision is kindness to the future. The thought settled in me with a satisfaction that had nothing to do with verdicts or settlements. I know the firm ran itself beautifully when I stepped away. which allowed me the luxury to think about scale not just as size but as consequence. We launched a materials library open to small studios, so they wouldn't have to beg samples with the fervor of supplicants. We started a tiny press that published pamphlets on the politics of space: who gets light, who gets noise, who gets the corner with the plant, and who gets the seat by the door. These were not headlines. They were, to me, the point. Someone asked, over lunch, whether I ever regretted not fighting uglier, not answering tabloid murmurs with my own. No, ugliness collects interest. It pays you back in late fees you don't notice until a decade has passed and you can't sleep for no good reason. My returns were elsewhere, in ledgers balanced without friction, in stares that hit the foot just right, in staff meetings that ended with people wanting to be better rather than smaller. Every so often a rumor would shuttle toward me about his personal life, vacations with glossy companions, a ring that may or may not have been a promise, a deal that smelled like overreach and then turned out fine. Rumors are a city's weather, present, changeable, unworthy of devotion. I kept my umbrella by the door and my phone on silent. It is a comfortable myth that wealth immunizes you from the sharp edges of the world. It does not. It gives you choice, which is better. My choices now were very clear. I could take on projects only if they added to the sum of civic dignity. I could decline meetings that would turn me into a version of myself I did not admire. I could pay people on time and sleep without rehearsing explanations. I could love without subscriptions and leave without invoices. On a late Sunday, I drove the coast road with the windows down, stopped for bread still warm from the furnace, and answered a text from a colleague in another time zone who had found the word she was groping for in a paragraph and wanted to share the small triumph. I wrote back with the heart of a mentor and the vocabulary of a friend. The sun lowered itself into the water with its usual modesty. I thought of the long route here, of gyms at dawn, of boardrooms, of papers slid across a table, of the quiet house after, of the first invoice with my own logo, of the first employee who bought her mother a ticket to visit because our payroll cleared Fridays like a promise kept. Sometimes a life breaks because someone leaves. Sometimes a life opens because you do. Mine did both in that sequence. The rest is practice, waking up, choosing again, spending well the limited energy we are given. If there is a moral, it is not about revenge or even survival. It is about authorship. I write this chapter, and I can write the next one without asking anyone to co-sign. That is a form of wealth that requires no court to recognize and no paper to enforce. Openings are loud. Closures, if you do them right, are quiet. The flagship hotel we delivered a year earlier had become exactly what we intended. A place that looked inevitable in photographs and better than inevitable in person. The lobby smelled faintly of cedar and citrus. The staff moved with the ease that comes from good back-of-house planning. And the staircase, our stubborn refusal to replace a simple rise with a performative atrium, was now the background of half the city's wedding portraits. It was a Tuesday when I stopped by unannounced with a notebook and no entourage, which is my preferred way of checking if dignity survives after opening night. The GM walked me through the usual updates: linen vendors, a bar manager with opinions, a small leak corrected before it became news. On my way out, I paused beneath the mezzanine and watched the afternoon shift take the floor. Housekeeping with carts that didn't squeak, front desk staff who knew how to lower their voices without lowering warmth. This is the kind of beauty no magazine will feature. Competence that travels like light. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number that included my name in the way only a person from a past life uses it, overfamiliar and slightly formal at once. A brief, tidy invitation. Would I be willing to meet for coffee? The sender signed with his first initial, as though apprenticed to discretion too late. I stood under that staircase and let the request sit unopened on the surface of my mind like a leaf on water. Then I answered with civility. We could meet at a cafe at the edge of the financial district in 6 days, mid-morning. No need to propose alternatives. I added the appointment to my calendar between a site review and a donor call and went back to my day. The city did its work in the intervening week. Meetings that began on time. A contract that needed one clause softened so people would not fail at their jobs trying to obey it. a celebratory dinner for a project manager who'd shepherded a tricky build to a gentle landing. My life continued to fit. I slept well. The cafe was all sunlight and nonchalance, tiled floor, a counter with real croissants, baristas who treated regulars like mild weather. He arrived 2 minutes early, as he always had. The suit fit his success. The watch told a story, if you like that kind of storytelling. He looked like a man the world had said yes to often. He also looked like a man who had started counting his yesies. We exchanged the greetings adults exchange when a decade lives between the first hello and this one. He spoke first, the way a person speaks who has practiced the key points and does not want to lose them to improvisation. He told me about expansion and contraction, about markets that behave like weather and teams that want honesty until it costs them. He described, in clean lines, a version of the last few years that fit into a headline and left no seam showing. Then he told me the part that mattered. An acquisition had gone ungracefully, the board wanted more theater than he could perform, and the machine he had helped build had begun to prefer the idea of him to the person. He smiled in the practiced way of men who must project inevitability for a living, and said, without the smile, that he was considering stepping away. He asked how I was. I told him the truth, the easy version and the real one. The firm ran well, the work still worked on me. I had become excellent at saying no to good invitations to preserve the capacity for the necessary ones. I said that I was, for the first time in my life, unafraid of a blank month on the calendar. He nodded at the right places, and this surprised me, looked briefly relieved. He did not apologize for the divorce. He did not need to. Apologies are currency best spent at the time of the debt. He did not ask for anything perfumed with nostalgia. He asked, instead, for advice. What do you do when the room you built no longer asks you to breathe, only to perform breath for others? I told him what I tell people I mentor when the room turns. You inventory what of yourself is core and what is costume. Then you leave anything that feeds on your core to survive. You keep the rest if it still feels like yours when you put it back on. He said this sounded like leaving money on the table. I said that long run, the table collapses if you keep stacking plates you don't want to eat. We finished our coffee. We parted exactly as we should have, with a handshake that meant thank you for the chapter we already wrote and an unspoken agreement not to re-edit it. I walked back into my morning light and did not dramatize it for myself. Some endings are a single good conversation in a neutral place. A month later, a public statement. He stepped down to pursue new ventures. It was written in the library voice of PR, which is fine. Not every truth deserves an audience. He was photographed on a boat with a group of people who looked like summer, then in a quiet panel talking about markets with the sort of clarity one regains when no longer selling a future to a room. I watched none of it closely. My attention is one of my most expensive assets. I spend it now like someone who knows the cost of waste. The year curled inward toward winter. At the studio, we finished a school designed around daylight instead of bells. The principal cried when she saw the way the afternoon softened the reading corner. We opened a small exhibition on rooms that make people kinder, which is the closest I have come to stating my thesis aloud. The foundation funded a childcare co-op attached to a trade program. The first cohort of parents graduated without having to choose between learning and picking up their kids on time. These are not splashy wins. They are the ones that let me sleep. One evening, my accountant sent me an end-of-year summary that made earlier versions of me laugh out loud at the numbers. It arrived as a neat PDF with charts designed to reassure. I closed it and went to my kitchen and cut into an orange with the same care I used to set a datum line on a drawing. Wealth, like loneliness, is a room that can distort you if you let it. I have learned to open a window. People assume the luxury is the villa, the travel, the dresses that do not argue with your body. Those are pleasant. The real luxury is being able to refuse what is almost right. The deeper luxury is to wake with your name still belonging to you after a decade in rooms that teach you otherwise. On a rain-polished afternoon, I walked the pier we'd helped design and watched strangers use it incorrectly. Feet on benches, children turning the low walls into balance beams, a couple shielding a kiss from the weather with a newspaper. It pleased me. Good design survives misuse because it has accounted for it without scolding. A woman with a stroller stopped and asked if I knew whether the cafe at the far end was open yet. She liked that one because they knew how to warm milk properly. I told her they were open until 5 and gave her a shortcut around a puddle the size of a small continent. She thanked me like I'd drawn the day closer to her side. A message arrived from my operations lead reminding me that the Lisbon studio wanted my input on a material schedule by tomorrow, but that she'd handle it if I preferred to keep my evening. I answered with 3 notes and a palmful of trust. Delegation is not abdication when you've hired adults and given them a clear north. Sometimes late memory sits down beside me like an old friend who will not move away no matter how many times you both change apartments. It brings a few scenes to screen. A kitchen from years ago, a laugh I once waited for the way you wait for a kettle to boil, a staircase at a gala, a quiet handshake over coffee. I let the scenes play. I do not fast forward. Then I turn them off and go to bed. Love did not fail. It completed its term. The contract changed. The capacity stayed. I have been asked privately whether I ever wanted revenge. The honest answer is no. Revenge is an architecture that spends steel on spectacle. I am in the business of buildings that stand. Justice arrived in the form of a fair settlement and a future I write. Grace arrived later, as the absence of a need to be seen winning. On the anniversary of my company's incorporation, we threw a party with terrible karaoke and good lighting. I gave a short toast that included no metaphors about storms or phoenixes. I thanked the people who make rooms kinder and the clients who let us prove that beauty and utility are not adversaries. After midnight, my staff pushed 2 sofas together and fell into a kind of heap only teams that trust one another can manage without embarrassment. I drove home with my shoes off and the radio low. Grateful for work that makes exhaustion feel like evidence rather than penalty. The sea was loud that night. I stood at the open doors and listened. Somewhere in the city, a younger version of me might have been measuring herself against someone else's fraction. This one stood unmeasured. In the morning, I would review a design that turned an old factory into a library and a housing complex into a community. Then call a former apprentice to tell her the grant had come through. Then sign a check I never imagined I'd be in a position to sign for a shelter that had outgrown its first courage. He built a fortune and gave it shape the way men like him do. I received, by law and by right, a portion of it. Then I built a life with returns that don't fit on a balance sheet. Rooms where people breathe easier, stairs that welcome tired legs, paydays that arrive without drama, a calendar with margins, a face in the mirror that matches the voice in my head. If he handed me papers once and expected the world to contract, the world did the opposite. It expanded until I could walk in it without shoes and without fear. What I want now is simple and expensive. To keep choosing in the direction of clarity, to keep spending my days on things that will not humiliate me when I am old, to keep my heart large enough for the work and small enough to fit back in my chest when the applause stops. Closure, finally, is not a verdict. It is a practice. Each morning I wake up, open the windows, and let the air move through the rooms I own in every sense of the word. And when the sea argues for constancy by changing, I nod back. We understand each other.